In this lecture, we'll look at the parts of the brain and their functions. The brain has a protective covering surrounding it known as the meninges. Sometimes the meninges can become inflamed, and this is known as meningitis. The causes of meningitis can be either bacterial or viral. To diagnose meningitis, a spinal tap of cerebrospinal fluid is necessary. In this tap, physicians will look for bacteria or for signs of viral infection. The danger is it could spread to the brain and cause encephalitis. The treatment for this condition is IV antibiotics. Also associated with the brain is cerebrospinal fluid. It serves to buoy the brain, it acts as a shock absorber, and it nourishes the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, is produced by the choroid plexus in the third and fourth ventricles of the brain. The choroid plexus is a place where you'll find a cluster of capillaries. Hydrocephalus will result when CSF drains too slowly. There's a picture illustrating this to the right. About 2% of the body weight is the brain, so the brain has its own blood supply. 15 to 20% of the resting cardiac output is used by the brain. 20% of the total oxygen intake is used by the brain. The brain is very active metabolically. About 1 to 2 minutes of oxygen deprivation will cause unconsciousness. 5 to 6 minutes of oxygen deprivation results in death. There is a very important blood-brain barrier. Its job is to protect the brain. It's made up of two different components: endothelial cells, and these are found in the capillaries. They form tight junctions, that is, no gaps, so things that might harm the brain are not permitted to cross. There are also neuroglial cells that are very tightly packed around the capillaries, so there's no leakage. The purpose is to prevent wastes, organic molecules, and antibiotics from crossing the brain where they might do damage. There are 4 divisions of the brain, and we're going to look at each of these: the brain stem, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. The job of the brain stem is to control the flow of messages between the brain and the rest of the body. The brain stem controls basic body functions like breathing, swallowing, heart rate, blood pressure, and consciousness. The brain stem is composed of 3 parts. They are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. You can see the brain stem indicated by the bracket on the photograph of the brain to the right. Let's look at the 3 parts of the brain stem. The midbrain has nuclei for cranial nerves number 3 and 4. The pons has nuclei for cranial nerves number 5, 6, and 7. And the medulla, or the medulla, contains ascending and descending tracts and has nuclei for cranial nerves 8 through 12. It is also the location of your visceral reflex centers. I mentioned that there are ascending and descending tracts in the medulla. Some of these tracts cross over one another. A tract is a collection of nerve fibers. The place they cross is called the decussation of pyramids. The result is muscles on the left side of the body are controlled by tissue on the right side of the cerebrum, and vice versa. This is true for sensory information as well. There are a number of visceral reflex centers located in the medulla. Some are more important than others. The cardiac center is the place where the heart rate and strength of contraction are controlled. The respiratory center controls rhythm and breathing. The vasomotor center controls the diameter of blood vessels and regulates blood pressure and flow. The less important centers are those that control coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, vomiting, and swallowing. The diencephalon is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and it's indicated by the red bracket on the picture to the right. Here you can see the location of the diencephalon, that is the hypothalamus and the thalamus. The thalamus acts as a relay station for sensory information. The hypothalamus monitors changes in the environment. It regulates body temperature. It regulates osmolarity. This is where the thirst center is found. It regulates the pituitary gland, and it is the control center for the autonomic nervous system. When you hear the term autonomic, you should think automatic, because that's what the autonomic nervous system is. The term cerebellum, or arbor vitae, means tree of life. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see why this is the name given the cerebellum. It coordinates the activity of the skeletal muscles, and it's important in posture and balance. The activities of the cerebellum are unconscious. The cerebrum is the largest structure in the brain. Each hemisphere of the cerebrum is concerned with sensory and motor functions of the opposite side of the body. And here's the result. The term for this is lateralization. In most right-handed people, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, logic, and math. The right hemisphere is dominant for intuition and emotion. The opposite is true in left-handed people. The cortex has important functional areas as well. This diagram shows you the surface of the brain. Each of those little hills or mounds is called a gyrus, and that's indicated by the number 1. A sulcus is an indentation in the brain surface, and this is number 2. A fissure is a very deep indentation, indicated by number 3. The cerebral cortex is just below the surface of the brain, and inside the cerebral cortex is located the medulla or the medulla. This diagram shows you the anatomy of the left hemisphere of the brain. You might want to go to your book or another source and see if you can fill this out. Answers are on the following slide. Here are the answers. A is the frontal lobe. A1 is the precentral gyrus. B is the central sulcus. C is the parietal lobe. C1 is the postcentral gyrus. D is the occipital lobe. E is the temporal lobe. F is the cerebellum. G is the pons. H is the medulla. And I is the spinal cord. We looked at the structural areas of the brain, but now we're going to look at the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. You may want to go to your book or another source and see if you can locate the functional areas and their names. Answers are on the following slide. Here are the correct answers for the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Number 1 is the pons, number 2 is the medulla, number 3 is the spinal cord, number 4 is the cerebellum, number 5 is the central sulcus, number 6 is the postcentral gyrus. This is the primary somatic sensory area. It perceives temperature, pressure, proprioception, and that means where your limbs are in space, and pain. Number 7 is the precentral gyrus. This is the primary motor area. Skeletal muscle actions are controlled from here. The primary visual area is number 8, and this interprets visual information. Number 9 is the premotor area, where stereotyped movements like dancing or playing the piano are controlled. Number 10 is Brokaw's area. It's the motor area for speech, but it's only located in the left hemisphere. Number 11 is the primary auditory area, and it interprets auditory information. And number 12 is the primary taste area. It's the gustatory cortex, and it interprets taste sensations. Let's talk for a moment about cerebrovascular accidents, or CVAs, also known as strokes. A CVA is a heart attack of the brain. Oxygen to parts of the brain is cut off. It's the most common disorder of the nervous system. Blood circulation to an area of the brain is blocked, and the brain tissue dies. The most common cause is a blood clot. Here is some terminology related to strokes. A thrombus is a stationary blood clot. An embolus is a moving blood clot. And a hemorrhagic stroke is profuse bleeding out of capillaries. Most strokes occur in the subarachnoid space, and a few occur in the subdural space. Typically, there are language deficits and paralysis on one side. The preventative treatment for this is aspirin therapy. Related to strokes, but not as severe, are transient ischemic attacks, also known as TIAs. They are strokes that are not completed. There's a temporary episode of reversible cerebral ischemia. That means that there's been a temporary stopping of blood to an area, but it can be restored. Ischemia means lack of a blood supply. These TIAs usually last for about 5 to 50 minutes. Patients will experience temporary numbness, paralysis, and impaired speech. Again, the preventative treatment is aspirin therapy. The usual dose is a baby aspirin or 81 milligrams of aspirin.